Why would David take somebody in the lineage of the king who had fallen and whom David replaced and adopt him into his household? This man posed a threat by his very existence, at least symbolically, to David's own claim to the throne. And yet that's what he did. He said, I'm taking you into my household, you have a seat at my table, I'll appoint people to manage your financial affairs, and I will treat you as family. The fact is, David had been best friends with Mephibosheth's father, Jonathan, who stood next in line to the throne to King Saul. In other words, by lineage, it would have been Jonathan, not David, who stood to become king of Israel when Saul died, which he did in battle. But Jonathan was killed too. Prior to that, however, he forfeited his claim to the throne in favor of David. The Bible tells us they were kindred spirits. They were like one person. And what's interesting about this is they were kindred spirits before they ever met, because they shared the same noble character. Just as David had taken on a 9-foot giant when the rest of Israel was cowering in the hills, Jonathan had rallied the Israel army in another battle years before. The Israeli army was outnumbered. King Saul was holding back with a few hundred men, unwilling to move forward against the Philistines. And Jonathan turned to his armor bearer one morning and said, in essence, let's go pick a fight, which he did. And between he and his armor bearer, they killed a number of Philistine soldiers. They attacked, 2 men. They attacked a Philistine garrison. And as the bloodshed mounted, the Philistines panicked, which prompted the rest of the Israeli army to pursue and win a great victory. So David and Jonathan were kindred in courage and in their devotion to God. If you read the stories in the Old Testament, in the book of Samuel, 1 Samuel, you'll see that they both relied on their faith and confidence in the God of Israel. And so Jonathan, even though David was on the run, threatened with death by his own father Saul, Jonathan went to David and stood with him and said, you're going to be king of Israel. I'm not. I'll stand next to you and support you. And they had such affection for each other that it drove them to form a covenant to take care of each other and to take care of each other's descendants if anything happened to either one of them. Covenants are the oldest, most sacred, and most binding forms of contracts ever devised. They go back to ancient times before there were armies or law enforcement officers, before there were governments of any kind, and before there was a legal structure to enforce contracts. And they worked as follows. There were several elements to them, but ultimately they were grounded in the integrity and the character of the people entering into them. A covenant always involved the following elements. There had to be a shedding of blood. That bloodshed symbolized what would be done and what you were agreeing to if you failed to perform and live up to the terms of the covenant. Sometimes they would cut themselves and drink each other's blood in the most ancient forms. Sometimes, most often, they would sacrifice an animal and say, this is what's to be done to me if I fail to live up to my agreement. And then they would engage in what's known as a fellowship meal. Always there was an oath, a vow to perform, to not break the terms of the covenant, regardless of feelings or circumstances. That's the reason you have covenants and contracts, because feelings and circumstances always change, but the person or persons you're engaged in the contract with, frankly, are relying on your performance, regardless of your circumstances. So a covenant always involved bloodshed. It always involved an oath, and it always invoked a third party guarantee. That party always being somebody stronger than either of the principles in the covenant. In other words, what you're saying is, we're killing this animal. May this be done to me if I fail to live up to my agreement. And to ensure that this be done to me, I grant authority to this higher, more powerful person or entity to enforce the terms of the agreement. Often they would swear by God, they might swear by the king. If you swear by your dead mother, that doesn't do much, okay? So this was always a testimony and an oath taken in the name of a more powerful third party, and often God. David and Jonathan had entered into this kind of a covenant, agreeing to take care of each other and each other's descendants should something happen to one of them, which it did to Jonathan. He was killed and fell in battle. Subsequent to this covenant, David was on the run. He ended up hiding out from King Saul by going to the enemy territory and working as a mercenary for the Philistines. Ultimately, the Philistines went to war with Saul and killed him. David then came back to Israel and was anointed king of the southern tribes, Judah and Benjamin. The northern tribes engaged in a civil war with David under the leadership of another of Saul's sons, who was ultimately killed, at which point David was crowned king over a unified Israel. He then took the city of Jebus and established his capital there. Jebus is one of the most ancient cities on earth, and it's still inhabited today. It was a stronghold, fortress city right in the middle of Israel. It had existed there for hundreds of years, surrounded by Israelis who were not their friends. And yet it was such a stronghold that Israel could not take it until David came into the picture. He was able to conquer the city of Jebus, which goes back to ancient times and actually was named even prior to that as Salem. Today it's known as Jerusalem. It's still a stronghold city, which three major religions claim as its source and its identity. So David captured the city and settled it. And there's three hills there that are of primary importance: Mount Zion, Mount Moriah, and the Mount of Olives, which became important in the New Testament times and is going to be important again at the end times when Christ returns. David established his throne on Mount Zion, which he called the City of David. He planned to build a temple, which his son actually did complete, across the valley on Mount Moriah. It was on Mount Moriah where Isaac and Abraham had come hundreds of years earlier, and Abraham had planned, in obedience to God's instruction, to kill and sacrifice his son Isaac. So these hilltops had significance throughout history. Now David claimed it for his capital and his capital city and renamed it Jerusalem. David is now at peace with his enemies. His kingship is established. He's enthroned on Mount Zion, and it comes to him that he made a vow. And so he asked the people around him, is there any of Jonathan's descendants that we need to seek out and find and show kindness to? And that's where Mephibosheth entered the picture.